Hello and welcome to Penguin TV. It is recorded by George Efelis, aka Whiffy Penguin, and you can follow me on Twitter at Whiffy Penguin. Penguin TV is hosted by PureMTGO.com and sponsored by MTGOTraders.com. Get an 8% discount off all orders over $50 when paying with PayPal or credit card. And you can check out CapeFearGames.com and get an extra 20% off when trading paper for digital. Enjoy the videos. Alright, so we're back with more Classic 101. This video is about Wasteland decks, and I refer to fish decks as Wasteland decks because ideally the fish decks don't do much in terms of raw power. These decks are very fair in the Classic format. Taking a look at this, we see one restricted card in Strip Mine. Which, goes along with our Wastelands. But the basic premise of these builds is that they apply pressure with their very large creature count. There's 21 guys in this deck. So they apply pressure with their creatures and their land destruction. The land destruction is not designed to lock them out of the game. The land destruction is in here just to keep people on the back foot. But when you're going turn 1 Noble Hierarch into turn 2 Tarmogoyf or Trigon or Dark Confidant and a Wasteland, keeping them on the back foot for a turn or two generally can lead to the win, especially since you're backing all this up with a couple of Force of Wills and some Spell Pierces. So this is not the original fish deck. The original fish deck is green-white. But this is 4-color fish, which Timmons took out of nowhere and brought to be one of the top decks in the format. This deck is designed to beat Workshop's face-in. In between Wasteland for Workshop, creatures to get around Thorn of Amethyst, and then we've got 7 removal spells for Workshop, as well as 6 free counter spells and another 4 pretty much hard counters. One of the things to realize with Workshop is that if they have mana floating from Workshop, they cannot pay mana to Spell Pierce, because Workshop will only allow them to pay mana to cast artifacts. And even though they have to pay the extra 2 to resolve the artifact, Spell Pierce doesn't make the artifact cost 2 more. Spell Pierce counters it unless they pay 2 to appease Spell Pierce. So that's something that you should know about if you are running Mishra's Workshop or against Mishra's Workshop. That Spell Pierce is almost a hard counter. And same thing with Daze, because they cannot use that Workshop mana to cast their spells or help resolve their spells. These guys over here also do quite a number on Oath of Druids. Personally, I think that the Fish on Oath matchup is just a little bit of lopsided, I want to say, in Oath of Druid's favor. Numbers in events don't actually reflect this, though. Especially my numbers against fish archetypes with Oath of Druids. I think that I am currently about a 40-60% split against fish decks with Oath. People in the comments, a la Timmons and Blazelix, and anyone else who enjoys playing the fish archetype, they can tell me if I'm wrong or right. But so that's how this deck would run. That's how you would try and approach the format. Is you want to just get some mana guys and some creatures down against Workshops, and then blow up some of their lands. One of the ways that I found this deck wins against Workshops is they will run out a couple of spheres, and then you end up wastelanding their Workshops and their Ancient Tombs, and they can't actually cast any of their spells anymore. That's one way to win. The other way is to just slam down Trigon Predator. This guy is amazing versus Workshops, and this build is built to get him out on turn 2. You see a 4th one over here in the sideboard. The sideboard it looks really janky, but all of these 10 anti-dredge cards are needed because dredge rolls over fish decks. it's just not even fun to play. And I like this format. Got a couple of Swords to Plowshares against the Oath build as well. But this is the primary version, and the one that's done the best. Another version would be this 4-color fish deck that splashes red instead of black, which Timmons unveiled a couple of weeks ago. We've got some Grim Lavamancers in the sideboard, and that's primarily for the Rise of Fish. Other differences is there's no Dark Confidant, again, Rise of Fish. Hello, Danger Linto. You can't be, paying 2 to 3 life every turn to Dark Confidant when your opponent is bashing down with creatures. And to help fix that problem, he has put Cold-Eyed Selkie in the deck. And now, the deck looks a lot more similar to the vintage build called Noble Fish, or Noble Selkie, or Selkie Strike, depending on which author or which particular version of the deck you're looking at. But this deck dismisses the days in favor of Mental Misstep. I am not currently sold on Mental Misstep. I think it's an okay card. I do not think that it's main deckable, though. A lot of people think that I'm stubborn, or that I'm just not giving it a fair shake, but I'm just basing this off of my personal combat against the card. Yes, it does some work, but primarily 1-drops in this format are not game winners, they're support cards. And counterspelling a support card seems sketchy when you could have this as a Spell Pierce or another Annul, counterspelling important cards like Time Vault or Oath of Druids. Again, we have a couple of Plows, we have the Trigons, we have a main deck Ancient Grudge to just even further push home that workshop advantage. We've still got the Wastelands and the Strip Mines. This version, with access to Grim Lavamancer, is a little bit better against the Dredge decks because you can shoot your own guys. It's still pretty terrible. He even runs the 4 Leyline of the Voids with no way to hardcast them because the matchup is just so terrible. We've also got some Leyline of Sanctities. I don't quite agree with these. I think that the deck, especially with Stifle, is set up to beat up on Storm decks or combo decks. But one card I do like out of the sideboard is Null Rod. Null Rod does work. I'm a big fan of Null Rod. So that is the other 4-color deck. The most recent deck that people saw in my article last week is this Christmas Beatings. I did a video, I did a deck tech, and I did another mock daily event with it. I would advise you to go over and look at it if you like this deck. There's the comment section is pretty nice. We got a good discussion going on the deck, and even a way to knock off about $400 from the total if you're willing to fight a little consistency errors. But once again, you see 4 Wastelands and that Strip Mine. This magical package of 5 land destruction effects. This is what keeps the fish decks in the metagame. Even with, all of this main deck hate I have against enchantments and artifacts, you still need these Wastelands to keep the opponent on the back foot and then win with your guys. Magus of the Moon is a beating. Chalice is a beating. But without Wastelands and Strip Mine, it just doesn't do enough. Another deck that I have for you is this Green-White Hate deck. Now, this is not the only version of Green-White Hate. This is the version that I think is the best, but it is definitely by far not the best version. Unlike the other few versions of Fish I've shown you, this deck, on top of the Wastelands and Strip Mine, also has Ghost Quarters. And part of the reason that it also has Ghost Quarters are these Leonin Relic Warders, or these Leonin Arbiters, I'm sorry, and these Aven Mind Sensors. I did an article on this about 2 or 3 months ago. If you're interested, you can go back and search and find it. I think it's a pretty nifty deck. Other versions of this deck run less Ghost Quarter and more utility bears, not quite hate bears like these guys, but utility, and they're green-white. These are the decks that Blazelix started playing back in Legacy when we first had the Legacy Classic split about, almost 2 years ago now. And, you know, he totally put green-white on the map in both formats, Legacy and Classic. All of the Death and Taxes lists that you see in modern-day Legacy, primarily, that's his fault. Or, you know, if you like those decks, that's his doing. Depends on your point of view, I suppose. We've got something that we haven't seen yet in Aether Vial. This is another kind of staple of the archetype. Either you're running Noble Hierarchs, or Birds of Paradises, or you're running Aether Vials. Some decks even run both Aether Vial and Noble Hierarch. One of the things I like about this deck is that it is infinitely cheaper than the blue versions of Fish, because you can knock off in between $400 and $600 depending on the current price of Force of Will. Another thing that I really like about this deck is that although it runs Savannas, all 4 of them, it runs no fetch lands based on the Leonin Arbiter, and it runs 3 different green-white dual lands, with Razorverge Thicket getting a nod, which I think is amazing that a card that was printed, you know, like 8-9 months ago is actually affecting a eternal format, and it's a land that is inferior in almost every way to the current mana base. But this deck makes it work, and I think that's awesome. There's also Horizon Canopy, which can give you a little bit of draw, which the deck is kind of lacking. Another way you might want to be able to go is to throw some Cold-Eyed Selkies in here, since even though they have that hybrid blue mana, they are still castable with just green and white mana symbols. This sideboard has a couple of Dredge hates. It's a little bit better than your traditional Fish decks against Dredge because of Gaddock Teeg. And also Qasali Pridemage has a target in Phyrexian Revoker to remove Bridge from Belows. These are small things, but they do help. They do help a lot. Also, we have an extra 3 Wastelands for Bazaar of Baghdad. And Crucible of Worlds. So all of these things definitely help to give you a little bit more of an edge against the Dredge decks. It still gets run over, but it's not quite as brutal. This is the first deck we've seen with Kataki for the Workshop decks. Currently, one of the better ways to just shut them out. Not the best, but one of the better ways. We've got a couple of Mindbreak traps for the Storm matchups, but with Gaddock Teeg and all of the land destruction and search restrictions, this deck also has a better than average matchup against the Storm decks. As long as you get a turn or two. This deck can't stop the nut draws. That's why there's Mindbreak traps. So that is green-white Fish. Here is a deck that is not quite there. This is about a tier 2 deck. But it's, again, another way to look at the format. It's actually a little terrible against Oath of Druids, but it has a really surprisingly good game against Workshop decks. And other Fish decks with Lightning Bolts and Hymn to Taurox. We also have access to Demonic Tutor. This is one of the few Fish decks that plays any of the Tutor cards. Well, we've got Vampiric, Imperial, and Demonic. And, you know, it's got Yawgmoth's Will, one of the few decks to play Yawgmoth's Will. And in this build, Yawgmoth's Will is not a combo card. This is a value card. Think of it as kind of like a Time Walk. You get an extra land out of your graveyard, maybe a discard spell, a tutor, and if you're lucky, you know, Dark Confidant or a Koth of the Hammer. This is admittedly not one of the better versions of Fish to play. But again, we see Strip Mine and 4 Wastelands in the deck. Lastly is a version of the deck that Xscorpio built, which is black, red, and white. And the black, red, and white version I'll pull up in just a second off of Classic Quarter. So here we are at Classic Quarter, viewing. This deck was actually run by NCSU31SB and not Scorpio, but I believe it's a carbon copy of his list. One of the reasons that I don't have this list in my deck editor is because I actually do not like this deck. It's a fine deck, but it is not something that I would enjoy playing. I personally feel that it's not quite strong enough when you could be playing either Force of Will or straight green-white. The lack of green in this deck is quite disturbing to me, but it's a black-red-white fish deck, and again, we see Strip Mine and 4 Wastelands. The deck also has Dark Confidant for card draw. It's got War Priest of Thune for enchantments, which is just much worse than Qasali Pridemage, in my opinion. We've got Grim Lavamancer, and now this is one of the reasons that I do like the deck, but I still wouldn't play it. The reason I do like this deck is because it is geared towards beating fish decks. And when this was being played, fish was starting to get really popular, and I believe that this deck posted either a 4-0 and 2 or 3 3-1s, or 3 or 4 3-1 finishes. We've got main deck Yixlid Jailers, which help against Dredge. Again, Dredge is not a large part of the metagame, so I think that this is a wasted slot, especially as a 4-of. And we've got Goblin Vandal to beat up on Workshop decks, which this does an okay job of. Turn 1 Goblin Vandal against, Spheres does the job. We've got Aether Vial to help push out against Spheres as well. Couple of tutors, Demonic Consultation, one of the few decks that can profitably run it since it's all 4-ofs. Bunch of Path the Exiles, because giving life in a deck that is trying to win on the beatdown train is not a good idea, so Swords to Plowshares does not get there. It's also got an Umezawa's Jitte, which, like I said, this deck is built to beat fish decks, and this card does an amazing job of winning creature combats. The sideboard has a Disenchant for Oath, Ethersworn Canonist. It's got 4 Ghost Quarters, which I find interesting that these are not main deck. I feel like it could be running a main deck. Again, it's got Sanctity, which I think that this version needs much more than any of the other fish decks, because all it really has is Thoughtseize and a sideboard Ethersworn Canonist to go up against combo decks. And then we've got Leyline of the Void for Dredge. Dark Blast is also a nice touch against other fish decks, because it's repeatable removal, and if you time it right, you can kill a 2-2 with it. But that was the black, red, white version. And there's also one more version of this archetype that people tend to play. And that is the straight Bant colored deck. Now, he does have Underground Sea, but it is purely for sideboard Yixlid Jailers. Other than that, there's no reason for black to be in the deck. It's just a straight green, blue, white deck. We see the use of Aether Vial in this build. We also see the use of Cold-Eyed Selkie as a 1-of, and main deck Kataki's War Wages. This deck is built more towards the shop and fish matchup than it is towards any of the other decks. We've got Dazes and Force of Wills, Spell Pierce, and Stifle. These are ubiquitous with the green, blue, white versions. And then we've got an extra Swords to Plowshares here. But this is the fish archetype as a whole. One of the best ways to beat this deck is to play powerful cards. The powerful cards would be Oath of Druids, Time Vault, Yawgmoth's Will. The cards are just better on average than anything that the fish decks can put out. Workshop decks, if you're playing against fish, you need to be sideboarding things like Razormane, Masticore, and Duplicant to take care of their creatures. Otherwise, it's an all uphill battle. To win with fish, you need to practice a lot. These are not decks that I would recommend to beginners of the format. because they're built to beat specific metagames. You need to know what metagame you're going into and how to actually win versus these decks. Because, like I've said, these are poor decks when you compare power levels. When you can win on turn 2 because of turn 1 Forbidden Orchard, Lotus Petal, Oath of Druids, you need to know what you're doing and how to mulligan when you're going to play a deck like this, or any of the fish archetypes that resolve around Wasteland and Strip Mine. But that's it for the fish archetype, and I hope you enjoyed it. We'll be moving on to the next archetype shortly.